My name is Taylor Reed. For 15 years, I wasn't just a surgeon, I was the one who designed the protocol that kept our most complex procedures from collapsing under pressure. I tracked every variable, every anomaly, every risk no one else wanted to touch. And that morning, I was supposed to perform a high-risk operation on a patient I had managed from the very first diagnosis. Instead, I was handed a quiet, clinical notification my surgical privileges had been internally suspended. No warning, no review, no conversation, just a decision. Dr. Brandon Kessler, our newly appointed chief medical officer, stood at the center of the room like he was presenting a budget cut, not dismantling a life-or-death process. He didn't look at me when he said it. We need someone more compliant. Compliant. That was his word for control. He had been in the building for less than 3 months, long enough to rename departments, shorten procedures, and reduce people into line items. I had spent over a decade building the system he was now casually overriding. Every step of that surgery depended on decisions I had already made, adjustments I had documented in ways only I fully understood. And he removed me 1 hour before execution. The room stayed quiet. No one defended me, no one questioned him. That was the moment the humiliation settled in, not loud, not explosive, just precise. So I nodded. Because my system access wasn't revoked yet. Because Slack was still open. Because if he wanted control, I was about to give him exactly that. I typed my resignation into the company-wide channel. No emotion, no explanation, just facts. Then I hit send, and as I walked out, I said the only thing that mattered. I didn't shut anything down. I just stepped out. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe, but only if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. What's the temperature like where you are right now? This is a fictional story. Some elements are enhanced with AI to make it more vivid. Now, take a slow breath, and let me show you exactly how it all unfolded. What bothered me wasn't the suspension itself, it was how easily 15 years disappeared from the room. I built that surgical protocol from the ground up, one complication at a time, until outcomes improved by 27%. I designed the real-time monitoring system that flagged instability before it became irreversible. I trained every resident who now stood silently around that table, repeating steps I had written, trusting safeguards I had put in place. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been simple. And yet, to Kessler, it was all replaceable. He had never led a high-risk operation, not once. His expertise lived in spreadsheets, not operating rooms, cut cost, streamline process, rebrand results. That was his version of medicine. Medicine is scalable, he said during one of his briefings, smiling like he had solved something profound. People are interchangeable. That was the moment I understood him. So, when he removed my name from the protocol documents, I wasn't surprised. When he reassigned my case to Nolan Price, a capable but inexperienced surgeon, I didn't argue. Nolan looked at me like he wanted to ask questions, but Kessler had already decided the narrative. This wasn't about skill. It never was. It was about control. I wasn't removed because I failed. I was removed because I couldn't be simplified. And as I walked away, something settled quietly in my mind. Every note in that patient file, every adjustment, every exception, was written in a language only I fully understood. Walking out of the hospital felt less like defeat and more like stepping out of a system I had already outgrown. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. There was no dramatic exit, no last attempt to defend myself. I simply took off my badge, placed it on the counter, and left, while everything behind me continued moving as if nothing had changed. That was the illusion they needed to believe the machine would keep running without the person who built its core logic. But systems don't run on belief. They run on continuity. By the time I reached the parking structure, the first internal alert had already been triggered inside the hospital's system. The status of the operation quietly shifted to continuity risk flagged. It wasn't loud. It didn't stop anything immediately. It simply marked the truth in a language only compliance teams and risk officers paid attention to. Minutes later, more alerts followed. The procedure wasn't just another surgery, it was part of a $12 million research program tied to outcome tracking, liability thresholds, and strict physician continuity requirements. Removing the primary surgeon that close to execution didn't just create a gap, it created exposure. I checked my personal email as I sat in my car, the screen lighting up with automated notifications I still had access to. I saved everything, every timestamp, every system flag, every decision tied to Kessler's authorization, inside the building. I knew exactly what was happening. Someone had seen the alerts. Someone had asked a question, and Kessler, predictable as ever, gave the only answer he ever believed in. Proceed. For a moment, nothing happened. No alarms, no shutdown, just movement continuing under pressure, but buried beneath that silence. The system recorded something far more important than panic. A single line, precise and irreversible, primary physician removed within critical window. By the time Nolan Price stepped into my place, the room hadn't collapsed, it had tightened. I wasn't there. But I knew exactly how it unfolded. Nolan wasn't reckless. He was careful. The kind of surgeon who double-checked everything before making a move. That's why Kessler chose him competent enough to execute, inexperienced enough to comply. At first, he treated it like any other handoff. He opened the patient file, reviewed the imaging, scanned the surgical plan I had built over weeks of adjustments. But then the rhythm broke. The data didn't flow. Sections of the chart referenced decisions without context. Dosage changes appeared without standard justification. Notes were precise but layered, built on evolving observations rather than static explanations. It wasn't missing information. It was information that required continuity to interpret. Nolan slowed down. Then he stopped. "Where's the reasoning behind this dosage adjustment?" he asked, looking up from the screen. Silence. No one in the room could answer him. The residents shifted slightly, flipping through sections they didn't fully understand. The attending nurse checked the system logs, hoping something obvious had been overlooked. Nothing. Kessler didn't hesitate. "Figure it out," he said, sharp and dismissive, as if clarity could be forced through pressure. But medicine doesn't work like that. Nolan's confidence began to fracture not outwardly, not dramatically, but in small, controlled pauses. He rechecked the imaging, cross-referenced the labs, tried to reconstruct the logic from fragments that were never meant to stand alone. Because they weren't. Every adjustment I made had been part of a chain. Every decision depended on the one before it, and without that chain, the protocol wasn't incomplete. It was unstable. Nolan leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as something finally clicked into place, not a solution, but a realization. He scrolled further down, past the notes, past the data, until he found the one line no one else had bothered to read carefully. The protocol didn't just recommend oversight, it required it. Final authorization, primary physician confirmation. If you think Dr. Brandon Kessler was right to remove me from the surgery just 1 hour before it began, comment right. But if you don't support that decision at all, comment wrong. Your opinion really matters. I'm genuinely curious what you think. Pressure doesn't explode all at once. It builds, layer by layer, until someone finally refuses to carry it. I wasn't in the room anymore, but I could picture the exact moment everything shifted. About 30 minutes before the operation, Nolan had reached the edge of what logic could justify. He had reviewed the file again, retraced every step, tried to reconstruct decisions that were never meant to be separated from the person who made them, and then he stopped trying. "I'm not signing this." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In a room like that, refusal carries its own weight. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Everyone there understood what that meant. Without a signed authorization, the procedure couldn't legally proceed under the hospital's own compliance framework. Not at that level of risk. Not under a research program with external funding tied to strict oversight And certainly not with the primary physician removed inside a critical window. Kessler reacted exactly the way people like him always do when control starts slipping. "You're overthinking this." He said it like the problem was Nolan's caution, not his own decision. But Nolan didn't move. "No, I'm protecting my license." That was the line Kessler couldn't override. Because this wasn't about confidence anymore. It was about liability. If something went wrong, and in high-risk surgery, Nolan would be the one answering for it. Not Kessler, not the board. Him. The room tightened again, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was resistance. No one stepped forward to replace him. No one volunteered to take the risk, because for the first time that day, the consequences were clear to everyone, not just buried in system logs or compliance alerts. They were personal, they were immediate, and they were irreversible, within minutes. The decision was made not by Kessler, not by authority, but by reality itself. The procedure was postponed. Just like that. Not delayed for convenience, not rescheduled as a routine adjustment, formally halted, because no one was willing to pretend the system still worked without the one person it had been built around. Systems don't panic. People do. The system just tells the truth. And this time, it told it to everyone at once, the moment the procedure was officially halted. The hospital's internal framework shifted from routine operation to risk containment. Automated alerts moved faster than any human explanation could keep up with. Compliance was notified first, flagged by the break in physician continuity, then risk management, triggered by the sudden procedural halt tied to a high-value case. Legal followed right behind. Because $12 million in research funding doesn't tolerate ambiguity. From the outside, it probably still looked controlled. Inside, it wasn't. The patient's family had already been prepped for surgery. They weren't expecting delays. And certainly not silence. When the word postponed reached them without a clear explanation, frustration turned into anger almost instantly. Why was the surgeon changed? Someone demanded. No one gave them a straight answer, because there wasn't one that sounded acceptable. Meanwhile, the financial layer started reacting. The procedure wasn't just medical, it was contractual. The research program funding, it had strict performance and continuity requirements. A last-minute disruption like this didn't just delay treatment, it triggered review clauses, potential penalties, and the very real possibility of losing the entire $12 million allocation. All of that, because one decision ignored one system dependency. And then there was slack. My resignation post had been simple, but simplicity spreads faster than explanations. Screenshots circulated, threads formed. People who had stayed quiet earlier started asking questions they weren't supposed to ask out loud. What happened? Why now? Who approved this? The narrative Kessler tried to control began slipping through his hands. Not because anyone challenged him directly, but because too many small truths started connecting, and somewhere in that noise, someone made a quieter move. No announcement, no confrontation, just a report, filed through the proper channel, anonymous, but precise enough to matter. The ethics committee had just been notified. Audits don't arrive with drama. They arrive with questions, and questions are far more dangerous. By the next morning, the internal review had already begun, not announced, not public, but moving quietly through the layers that actually mattered. Compliance pulled the logs. Risk management reconstructed the timeline. Legal started asking for documentation that should have existed if the decision had been legitimate. It didn't take long. The suspension of my surgical privileges, what Kessler had framed as a necessary adjustment, had no documented review, no peer evaluation, no independent sign-off, just a directive, issued and executed within a critical window, bypassing every safeguard designed to prevent exactly that kind of decision. In other words, it wasn't a process. It was a move. Kessler tried to regain control the only way he could, by rewriting the narrative. He suggested I had been uncooperative, that I had complicated workflows, that removing me was part of a broader operational improvement, the kind of language that sounds reasonable until someone checks the details. And they did. Because the system doesn't care about narratives. It records actions. Every access point, every authorization, every override. When the logs were reviewed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The timing, the lack of escalation, the absence of required approvals, all of it traced back to a single origin. Him. You acted unilaterally, someone asked during the review. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. That question didn't need emphasis. It carried its own consequence. For the first time since he walked into the hospital, Kessler didn't have an immediate answer, because there wasn't one that aligned with policy, or with liability, or with the reality now documented across multiple departments. And once that door opened, everything behind it started collapsing. Because the surgery wasn't just delayed, it was part of something bigger. The research program funding, it came under immediate review. External partners were notified. Risk exposure expanded beyond the hospital walls. Then the final decision came through. Quiet but absolute. The entire program was frozen. Control doesn't disappear overnight. It shifts, quietly, to whoever understands the system better. When they reached out, it wasn't an apology, it was a request carefully worded, legally structured, and deliberately distant. I wasn't being asked to return as staff. That door was closed. Instead, they wanted me back as an independent consultant, someone who could assess the damage without being part of it. I agreed. Not because I needed the position, but because I wanted to see how far the consequences had traveled. Walking into the conference room felt different this time. No badge, no assigned seat, just a chair at the far end of the table and a room full of people who suddenly understood exactly what I had been responsible for. Kessler was already there, still composed, still holding on to authority like it hadn't started slipping through his fingers. He looked at me briefly, then away. The meeting started without introductions. Legal outlined the findings. Compliance confirmed the timeline. Risk management detailed the exposure. No one needed to explain why I was there. They already knew when it was my turn to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You didn't remove me, I said calmly. You removed the system that kept this place safe. The room stayed still. Kessler leaned forward slightly, forcing a thin smile. You're exaggerating. That was predictable. What wasn't predictable, at least not to him, was how quickly that statement unraveled. She's not. Legal responded. Without hesitation, no emotion, just confirmation. Because by then, everything I had built wasn't theory anymore. It was evidence. It was documented in system behavior, in halted procedures, in frozen funding, in every report now sitting in front of them. This wasn't about perspective. It was about impact. Kessler's expression shifted not dramatically, but enough. The certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to calculation. He started to speak again. But this time, no one interrupted him. They didn't need to, because the decision had already moved beyond him. By the end of the meeting, the conversation changed direction, not toward recovery, but toward accountability. And for the first time since all of this began, his position was no longer the one being protected. It was the one being reviewed. Consequences don't arrive with noise. They settle in, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold on to. By the end of that week, the shift was no longer subtle. Kessler had been formally suspended, pending investigation, not reassigned, not protected, suspended. The language in the notice was careful, but the meaning wasn't. His unilateral decision, once framed as leadership, had become the center of a liability review that extended far beyond a single surgery. And once that process started, it didn't slow down. The hospital lost the $12 million research program almost immediately. External partners pulled back, citing protocol violations and risk exposure. Regulatory oversight followed, not because of what happened to me, but because of what my removal revealed: gaps in governance, in accountability, in the very safeguards they claimed to enforce. Inside the system, everything tightened. Approvals slowed. Reviews deepened. Every decision now carried weight it didn't have before. Nolan, meanwhile, was no longer the uncertain replacement standing in a compromised position. The audit confirmed what he already knew, that refusing to sign had been the only defensible choice. What could have ended his career instead positioned him as a primary witness. Not against me, against the process that put him there. We spoke briefly, once. "You were right," he said. "No," I replied. "You just didn't ignore what you saw." That was the difference. The patient's family made their decision just as clearly. They withdrew consent from the hospital and requested transfer. Not quietly, not passively. They asked for me by name. Not because I had asked them to, but because trust doesn't disappear as easily as authority assumes. Arrangements were made, the case moved, and just like that. The system that had pushed me out lost the very thing it had tried to control. They reached out again after that. Different tone, different urgency, an offer to return. Reinstate. Restore. This time, I didn't even consider it, because walking back in as an employee would mean pretending nothing had changed, and everything had. So I declined, quietly, completely, and permanently. Starting over didn't feel like rebuilding. It felt like finally working without interference. The new center was smaller, quieter, and far less interested in appearances. No inflated titles. No unnecessary layers of approval, just people who understood what their roles meant and what happened when those roles were ignored. I wasn't there to prove anything anymore. I was there to do the work the way it was meant to be done. This time, I built my own team, carefully, intentionally, not based on hierarchy, but on judgment. Every person in that room understood the weight of a decision, not just the procedure itself. We didn't rush. We didn't simplify what couldn't be simplified. And when the patient arrived, everything felt different, not easier, but clearer. We reviewed every step together, not because we had to, but because we chose to. The system we followed wasn't something imposed from above, it was something we understood from within. Every adjustment had context. Every decision had ownership. When the surgery began, there was no tension in the room, only focus. And when it ended the way it was supposed to. Stable, controlled, successful. No surprises, no last-minute confusion, no missing pieces. Just a process that worked because the people inside it respected what it required. Afterward, I stood in the recovery unit for a moment longer than necessary, watching the monitors settle into steady patterns, not out of relief, but out of recognition. This was what had been taken for granted. This was what they thought could be replaced. But systems don't fail when people leave. They fail when the people in charge don't understand what made them work in the first place. I didn't need to go back to prove that. I had already moved forward, and in the quiet that followed, the truth felt simple. They thought I was replaceable. Turns out, responsibility isn't looking back. I realized this was never just about losing a position. It was about understanding my value before someone else tried to redefine it for me. I chose to walk away instead of staying where integrity was negotiable, where safety could be replaced by convenience, and where experience was treated like a cost instead of a responsibility. That choice wasn't easy, but it was necessary, because sometimes protecting what you stand for matters more than holding on to where you stand. If you would choose to leave rather than compromise your standards, write yes. If you think staying and fighting from within is the better path, write no. And if you're still thinking it through, write time. There's no perfect answer, only the one you can live with. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own worth, or helped you see things a little clearer, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. You're not just supporting a channel, you're helping stories like this reach someone who might need the strength to make their own decision. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.